Ukrainian officials say Russian missile attacks killed at least 13 civilians and wounded dozens more in the southern city of Zaporizhzhia. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy called the daytime attacks cruel. He's urging Ukraine's allies to step up the pressure on Russia. This week, Zelenskyy is due to meet key allies, including U.S. officials, to drum up support for the last time before Donald Trump takes the White House.
Shock and grief, and debris everywhere. According to authorities, Russian strikes hit a bus, killing and injuring passengers. Other vehicles and buildings also came under attack.
People were leaving from work through the main entrance of a building, and that's when the attack happened. There were two very loud explosions. Explosion, fog, smoke. People fell down. They were crossing the road when the strike hit.
Ukrainian officials say minutes before the attack, people had been warned of high-speed missiles and glide bombs being fired at the Zaporizhzhia region. For some, though, the warnings came too late. The Ukrainian president accused Russia of deliberately targeting civilians.
We must put pressure on Moscow. We must force Russia into peace. We must continue doing everything necessary to protect lives and stop deaths. And at the same time, it's crucial to maintain the unity of all our partners, America and Europe, and our partners around the world who are helping us.
The UN says war between Russia and Ukraine is intensifying.
As we approach 3 years since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, progress towards a peaceful resolution remains elusive as we witness a dangerous escalation of hostilities.
So far, the war has killed and wounded tens of thousands of fighters and civilians.
Rizzo is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She joins us now from Washington, D.C. So as we heard in the report, the UN is saying that the war is intensifying. Why do you think that is?
So I think that there has been a few months here where both sides have been somewhat at a stalemate, grinding meters, perhaps a few kilometers here and there. But there's a couple things to note. First is that Biden is leaving office and Trump is coming into office. Biden has been a stalwart supporter of Ukraine. You can argue whether or not his approach or what he sent Ukraine has been effective, but he's certainly been a stalwart supporter of Ukraine's fight. Trump is kind of on the fence about this. And so I think that there's a sense on both sides, Russia, that it needs to gain as much territory as possible, even through indiscriminate bombings and killing civilians, as it's done for years now. And Ukraine in the sense that it needs to gain back as much territory as possible in the next few weeks.
Now, after this latest attack, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has again urged his Western allies to step up pressure on Russia. But after years of sanction and military support for Kyiv, what exactly could that look like?
So there's a couple of things here. I mean, first is obviously more weapons. These are ammunition, air defenses, things that Zelenskyy and Ukraine have been asking for time and time again, and things that the U.S. and Europe have indeed supplied, but should do so in larger numbers. The other thing that you mentioned is economic sanctions. Specifically, Russia's banking and financial sector. Earlier in 2024, the U.S. sanctioned Gazprom Bank, the country's largest bank, along with 50 other smaller financial institutions. They could expand these to include all Russian banks, perhaps. They could also expand the scope of secondary sanctions, those that cover third parties that do business with sanctioned entities, so Chinese companies supplying Russia's war machine. And then finally, some also argue that the Trump administration should expand sanctions to cover Russian oil providers and their subsidiaries, something that's been avoided thus far because of concerns over price increases for Europe.
Now, you mentioned air defense systems, and we know that Zelenskyy is due in Germany for the so-called Ramstein group meeting, where he's expected to appeal for more of those defense systems. Do you think he'll actually get what he wants this time around?
So this is the 25th convening of the Ukraine Defense contact group, as you mentioned, called the Ramstein Group. And this one will look at, as it has done in the past, Ukraine's immediate battlefield needs, but also its longer-term defense requirements as well. This goes all the way into 2027, as reports from the Pentagon have stated. So this means, according to the Defense Department, focusing on the delivery of key capabilities, including air defense system. This is specifically noted by the Defense Department. Also includes artillery munitions and armored vehicles, as well as efforts by the United States and Europe to bolster and support Ukraine's own defense industrial base. So let's see what happens. Supplies are low, but the hope is that the Biden administration wants to leave on a strong note and leave Ukraine in the strongest position it can before Trump comes into office just a few days from now.
Well, exactly. And the president-elect actually recently stated that he hopes the war would end within 6 months. Do you think that timetable is realistic?
Well, I think the word end is being a little bit loosely used here because it means different things to different people. I think for Ukraine, what an end of the war would look like is not just a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities, but also long-term security guarantees. And Zelenskyy and many other people have stated that they don't believe that their long-term security can be guaranteed without an invitation to join NATO, an explicit invitation to join NATO. And that is not something that's happened yet. Now, of course, Russia has shown no desire up until now to come to the table for a potential negotiation, a potential ceasefire. So I think the word ending the war is a tough one, but I do think we could see a point where negotiations on what a potential ceasefire might look like could start soon after Donald Trump enters office. And that's something we should all be watching very closely.
For more on this, I'm joined by Joshua Shifrinson, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and Associate Professor at the University of Maryland. Thank you for joining us. So Donald Trump says Thank you. Donald Trump says he hopes the war will be over in the next 6 months. But the question is, what would an acceptable end look like for Russia, and what would it look like for Ukraine?
Well, we have to distinguish between the ideal and the pragmatic when we talk about acceptability. I think for Russia, the ideal acceptable would be essentially control over Ukraine, not necessarily incorporating Ukraine into Russia, but control over Ukrainian politics, over Ukrainian geopolitics, and certainly no membership in NATO for Ukraine. Whereas for Ukraine, obviously, there's a desire to reclaim the lost territories in the Donbass, as well as the desirability of gaining, if not admission into NATO, certainly the gold standard, then security guarantees. I think pragmatically, there's something in the middle that we might see as acceptable, but those are the ideal outcomes at the moment.
Now, you mentioned Ukrainian membership of NATO. Of course, that is always on the table when it comes to the demands, but would NATO be willing to accept a member involved in an active conflict with Russia?
Almost certainly not. We've already seen during the war, the U.S., Germany, and others being incredibly reluctant to even consider Ukrainian membership in the alliance so long as the war is a hot war. And indeed, there's even concerns that as long as the war may resume in the future, this is not a candidate for membership that the alliance would like to take on at this time.
Now, speaking pragmatically, what type of concessions would both sides have to make if they are to reach a ceasefire deal?
Well, I think on Russia's part, it's going to have to give up the idea of controlling Ukraine, even by a proxy, by denazifying the regime, as they put it. That's obviously a myth, but that's certainly the claim. Likewise, they're going to have to accept that Ukraine will have to have the ability to deter, if not defend itself in the future using its own resources on its own terms. For Ukraine, on the other hand, we're talking about a situation, and Zelenskyy has already alluded to this, where the idea of reclaiming all the territory lost to Russia in the opening days of the hostilities falls by the wayside. And yes, Ukraine is likely going to need to step back from its NATO membership aspirations, at least as a politically realistic objective in the near term.
Now, as you mentioned there, Moscow and Kiev are still miles apart in their goals. Do you think we could see an end to the war, or is it more likely to become a frozen conflict if a ceasefire deal is ever to be reached?
Well, a frozen conflict is still a war that has stopped. So I think a ceasefire deal is a kind of end to the war, or a frozen conflict is kind of an end to the war. But if the idea is a peace treaty akin to what we saw in 1945 or in 1918, I think it's far more likely we're going to see something ceasefire that gradually diminishes the fighting in intensity, akin to what we saw in Korea in 1953. Or the various Arab-Israeli ceasefires that held for a period of time, at least, in the 1950s and 1960s before peace was formally codified decades later.
Now, Vladimir Putin has long used the specter of NATO to justify some of his country's more controversial foreign policies. Do you anticipate a change after the West's handling of the Ukraine conflict?
If there's going to be a change, it's only going to be more intense. It's very obvious that Putin blames the West, broadly defined, for preventing him from achieving victory against Kyiv during the course of the conflict. We can debate whether that's a legitimate position or not. But if that's going to be Putin's interpretation of events, as he already alludes to, then we're going to see Putin blaming the West and blaming NATO in particular more and more as a cause of the conflict and justifying further Russian foreign policy behaviors because of the specter of NATO enlargement.
That was Joshua Shifrinson, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and Associate Professor at the University of Maryland. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.